The man suddenly sensed that something was wrong. The security guard's breast pocket card didn't just have faint bloodstains, but clearly didn't belong to the same person. "Why is Ron's card with you?" Unexpectedly, this question became the trigger. Fortunately, the man reacted quickly and immediately broke free from the restraint. He then began his counterattack, continuously striking the opponent. However, the cramped elevator compartment prevented the two muscular men from fully executing their moves comfortably. Thus, neither was able to seriously injure the other for a while. But eventually, the man's quick reflexes allowed him to gradually gain the upper hand. After knocking the man to the floor, he was about to pick up the handgun nearby. Yet, unexpectedly, the opponent started exerting force again. He not only prevented the man's next move, but also snapped the handrail of the elevator. The situation was once again reversed. The man took a few painful blows and was then tightly choked by the assailant. At this point, reaching for the gun was impossible. Although the man was a retired Marine who had been through many battles, he could only struggle and call for help from the timid boy standing aside. Finally, at the crucial moment, he succeeded in turning the tables and killing the attacker. Just then, the elevator reached the floor. Only at this moment did the man realize what was about to happen here. So he quickly took the thug's access card and radio, because now the lives of 35,000 people in the entire stadium were in extreme danger, especially his niece Danny, who was also inside. But how exactly did all of this happen? The man's name is John. He had initially taken Danny to the stadium to watch the game. But as soon as they sat down, Danny said she was hungry. Seeing this, John got up intending to buy 2 hot dogs. However, just as he was queuing, all the stadium lights suddenly went dark. Because power was restored only a few seconds later, the monitoring staff were not alerted by this incident. No one knew that this was the exact moment when intruders had breached their control system. Very quickly, a group of terrorists inside the stadium began to move. Each of them was heavily armed. A few then headed straight into the backstage area of the stadium. A staff member who saw them tried to intervene, but was immediately shot dead with 2 rounds. After this, the group did not stop, but stormed straight into the surveillance room. Their brutal methods terrified everyone, to the point where they dared not move. After taking control of the situation here, the leader White spoke directly to the head of security. White informed the security chief that communications had been isolated and that he could not contact the outside world. White commanded that as the on-site commander, the chief's subordinates in the stadium would contact him every 10 minutes and he must reply, "Normal." The chief refused to comply. Seeing this, the ruthless White took direct action. He then took out a picture of the chief's family and stated their exact current location. Faced with such a threat, the chief began to panic. Having no other choice, he ultimately compromised. After resolving this crucial step, a thug performed a series of operations on a computer. Next, all the major gates of the stadium were closed. Furthermore, all rooms were successfully locked for what they considered wartime needs. Clearly, this place had become an unbreakable, fortified prison. Naturally, everyone present was completely unaware of this development, and the soccer match officially began at this very moment. The fans were currently immersed in the joyful atmosphere. Not long after John finished buying the hot dogs and returned, but he quickly discovered his niece Danny had vanished without a trace, so he hurriedly called her. It turned out she had been lured away by a friend. However, upon receiving her uncle's call, she ignored it, distracted by the smooth-talking compliments of a handsome guy. John was anxious about not finding his niece, so he called her again. But right at this moment, the incident occurred. By White's order, all nearby broadcast towers were set on fire, simultaneously causing John's phone to instantly lose signal. He finally realized that others were experiencing the same situation. Although this abnormal phenomenon attracted many people's attention, it was quickly overshadowed by the lively atmosphere at the venue. At the same time, the terrorists began cross-referencing the faces of everyone in the stadium. It turned out they were looking for a very important person. Speaking of John, he accidentally spotted a young staff member named Faisal near the edge of the field. He hurriedly walked over to ask for help. After learning about John's concerns, Faisal reassured him, saying that for technical reasons, the stadium's main gates had been closed, so Danny absolutely could not have left. He then enthusiastically called the control room. Initially, he wanted to use the surveillance camera to find Danny, but unexpectedly the other side did not answer, no matter how many times he called. Seeing this, John, who was extremely anxious, suggested going to the control room himself. Faisal reluctantly agreed to lead him there directly. But as soon as they entered the backstage area, he was shocked to find that the security guards had been replaced and they were stopped by the new personnel outside. "You'd better stay out of my way." This sentence successfully provoked the fake guard. He planned to lead both of them upstairs and kill them. But he couldn't have known that he was dealing with a tough opponent today. In the end, his identity was not only exposed, but this also brought a deadly disaster upon himself. After dealing with the situation, John picked up the assailant's handgun because he was determined to uncover the truth, especially since his niece was still inside the stadium. Immediately afterward, they not only wiped down the elevator, but also carried the corpse to the restroom and hid it. Next, John discovered C4 explosive in the thug's bag. This sight completely terrified him. John knew for sure that someone was carrying out a terrorist act here, so he quickly stuffed these items into his own pocket. The next thing they needed to do was quickly find a landline phone. Naturally, Faisal was very familiar with the area, but John quickly discovered that the landline also had no signal. It seemed the terrorists had cut off all communication from this place to the outside world. However, this couldn't stump a veteran soldier who had been through hundreds of battles. John then modified a radio and successfully contacted the police. Once the signal connected, he quickly reported the situation unfolding inside the stadium to them. But entirely unexpectedly, the operator thought this was a prank and asked John how he knew there were terrorists. John calmly replied that it was because he had just killed one of them. This time, the operator finally started to take the matter seriously and reported the stadium's loss of signal to the police force's highest commander. The commander then made a satellite call to the chief, who was inside the control room. Facing White's threat, the chief had no choice but to lie. The commander didn't detect anything unusual, and White was relieved that the situation hadn't been exposed. Naturally, John had no idea that his warning was actually being treated as a joke by the police. Immediately after his communication channel was cut off, which dashed their hope for help, John couldn't help but worry about Danny's safety. It was at this exact moment that a roll call was heard over the radio he had picked up. Seeing this, John hurriedly recorded the numbers. However, when the other party called the name Andre, no one responded. It took John a few seconds to react, but it was already too late. Clearly, the opponents were starting to be suspicious. Indeed, the woman reported this unusual situation to White. Next, two thugs went to their comrade's location. After failing to find him, they frantically searched the surroundings. Not long after, they both discovered their comrade's body in the restroom. At the same time, White also received the information that his subordinate had been shot dead. This immediately made him realize that someone must have discovered their presence. So he immediately instructed his subordinates to check the usage of Andre's access card. Sure enough, they found that someone had just used it to open the door to the catering area on the 4th floor. Then, based on the route they found, it had opened the kitchen door. It seemed the intruder wanted to get to the rooftop. Seeing this, White quickly dispatched two of his subordinates. They were clearly assassins with extensive combat experience. John, completely unaware of this, was trying to leave the kitchen, but he quickly discovered that his access card had been deactivated. This immediately put him on high alert. However, to their horror, they found the door they had just entered through was also locked. It seemed both of them were trapped inside. John knew for sure this was the work of the terrorists. Indeed, White's voice then came through the radio demanding that he surrender immediately. Seeing this, John hurriedly pushed Faisal into the nearby service elevator. He then took out a picture of Danny and briefly described her appearance. He asked the boy to find his niece for him and take her to safety. But just then, voices could be heard from outside. Indeed, the two thugs had arrived outside the kitchen door. However, when they rushed in, they saw no one. But they both knew the opponent must be hiding somewhere. At this moment, the bald man noticed the door to the cold storage was ajar. He then cautiously stepped inside. Unexpectedly, the next second, the cold storage door slammed shut. John then immediately pulled the trigger, hitting the other man. Surprisingly, the opponent was still able to counterattack. Immediately after, the two sides began a life-and-death struggle. John clearly had the upper hand. After a few rounds, he successfully severed all of the opponent's fingers. At the same time, the bald man in the cold storage room was so enraged, he roared. Although the sealed metal door was quite thick and heavy, the lock was loosened under rifle fire. He finally succeeded in kicking the door wide open. By now, the battle between the two outside had entered a fierce stage. Just when John seemed about to gain the advantage, the bald man suddenly burst out. Fortunately, John dodged in time and avoided injury. Taking advantage of this gap, the remaining thug quickly picked up the handgun on the ground. Perhaps due to the beating, he lost all reason. He completely ignored the severed gas pipe and resolutely pulled the trigger. This action led to his own demise. However, the bald man did not turn back to help, but once again aimed his gun at John, who was trying to run away, and kept firing until he ran out of bullets. This created an opportunity for John to counterattack. He decisively charged out. Unexpectedly, this action completely enraged the bald man, immediately after he was knocked to the ground by a series of the opponent's punches. Thus, the two bullish, muscular men began a head-on showdown. Initially, John was completely unable to defend himself, but he was lucky enough to pick up a fork from the floor. Although he successfully landed a blow, it only made the bald man angrier, causing him to unleash his full strength. John was then lifted and thrown flying. The situation became increasingly disadvantageous for John. Next, the bald man intended to forcefully thrust his head into the hot boiling oil. In the nick of time, John gritted his teeth against the pain and quickly grabbed the paring knife that had just fallen into the oil. The next second, he completed a fatal counterattack. Finally, the bald man met his death. At this point, John had successfully overcome this crisis, and White quickly learned that his two subordinates were dead. They absolutely refused to believe that two top-seasoned soldiers had been killed so easily by the opponent. So the female assassin rushed with her team to confirm. Only then did they realize they had truly encountered a formidable opponent. But at this moment, John chose not to run away. Instead, he made every effort to drag one of the corpses onto the rooftop. He then stuffed a C4 bomb into the man's clothes and threw the body straight down outside the stadium. Indeed, this action successfully attracted a large number of police, and they quickly surrounded the entire stadium. White also took notice of the situation outside. However, the person he wanted to find had still not been located. But time was running out, preventing him from continuing to search person by person, so he decided to use a traditional method to find that person. He then used the radio to call a subordinate to prepare immediately because he planned to execute Plan B. At the same time, the police commander arrived at the scene. At this point, he finally believed John's words. He then quickly unlocked John's radio frequency. John told him they were facing a highly trained paramilitary group. There were 10 of them, but John had eliminated 3 20 minutes ago. The commander called him a lone hero, but John replied that he didn't want to be a hero. He only cared about his niece, who was still in the stadium and would not abandon her. And at the same time, White led his subordinates straight into the live broadcast room. They used similar tactics, killing 2 people first, then successfully controlling the remaining staff through fear. Next, White handed the host a script. It turned out he wanted to negotiate directly with the government via television. If they did not provide Terry's location before the match ended, they would detonate 100 C4 bombs, trading the lives of 35,000 people present for one person. Live on air, White issued a clear threat if anyone tried to enter the stadium or attempted to contact the hostages inside, they would immediately detonate the C4 bombs. He emphasized that some people had already died, but many more would die, and that depended on the decision of the government and the police force. White then began executing a person right in front of all the viewers. This scene terrified the witnessing public, and the commander had never dealt with such a difficult situation. So he ordered the immediate evacuation of neighboring streets. Special forces and the air wing had to deploy immediately and stand ready for orders. Naturally, the people in the entire stadium had no idea what was happening. They were still enthusiastically watching the game. However, John knew how serious the current situation was, but Faisal still hadn't found Danny. Having no other choice, he could only search carefully using the binoculars. But just as he was anxiously searching, Danny was in a secluded corner, chatting with the young man. She was completely unaware of what she was about to face, because White and his accomplices had now identified John's face through the surveillance camera. So they kept rewinding and searching to try and figure out what he cared about. By now, the area outside the stadium was packed with news reporters from all over the world. This certainly gave the police commander a headache. But just at this moment, the specialist sent by the high command also arrived at the scene. Although the corpse thrown out was burned to the point of being disfigured, he immediately recognized the identity of the person. The specialist immediately ordered the surrounding police to evacuate. He then told the commander the true identity of this terrorist group. It turned out that Terry, whom White was looking for, was once the supreme commander of a nation's revolutionary army. Decades ago, he and his younger brother White led a popular uprising. But the revolution quickly spun out of control, leading to a large number of innocent deaths. Because this completely went against Terry's original purpose, he sought refuge in the police commander's country to fake his own death and change his appearance. Ultimately, the revolution failed with the death of the leader. Gradually, that nation restored peace. But 3 months ago, White unexpectedly discovered this secret. That is why he appeared at the stadium, because capturing Terry would also help him achieve a greater purpose. Although the commander now knew the full story, the specialist hadn't come to provide Terry's location. Instead, he was there to eliminate him directly to prevent future trouble. It seems things are getting increasingly complicated. Meanwhile, White had spotted Danny next to John when he first entered the arena. Her personal information was quickly tracked down. At this moment, Danny had just slipped away from the young man and was on her way back to her seat. Just then, her name echoed over the stadium loudspeaker. The announcement over the loudspeaker reached John's ears. He immediately knew something was wrong and hurriedly told Faisal to quickly find and intercept Danny. While speaking, John had also spotted her figure, but no matter how much he yelled, Danny couldn't hear him. Seeing her about to fall into the hands of the thugs, John had no choice but to risk jumping down from the maintenance walkway. He then quickly rushed into the crowd. However, the distance between them was too great, so Danny couldn't hear her uncle calling. This scene was spotted by White, who ordered the security chief to send men to hunt down John. With no alternative, the chief had to order his subordinates to block John. This did temporarily stop John, but he used all his strength to try to break free from the encirclement. However, since he was alone, John was quickly subdued by the on-duty security officers. But he absolutely could not let Danny be in danger, so John, desperate to save her, struggled violently to break free. He then began a fierce struggle with this group of men. Powerless against the sheer number of opponents, he was eventually pinned down against a railing. It was at this moment that he noticed Danny had walked close to Gate 8. 2 thugs were waiting for her there. Fortunately, his call still reached her ears. At the same time, she also noticed the commotion caused by John. But at this point, the 2 thugs had also spotted her. Simultaneously, a goal was scored on the field. The crowd immediately erupted in cheers of joy. John took advantage of the commotion to once again break free from restraint. After successfully knocking down 2 officers, he bolted towards Danny. At this moment, the roaring fans blocked the path of the 2 thugs, allowing Faisal to timely push Danny to hide under a banner. This was just in time, causing the thug to miss his grab, and Danny was successfully rescued. At this point, John also made a safe escape. Just then, the halftime whistle blew. Clearly, White was running out of time, and John's escape infuriated him to the extreme, so he angrily shot the security chief dead. Not long after, Faisal led Danny and finally met up with her uncle. This relieved John's anxiety, but now they needed to leave the stadium as soon as possible. And Faisal was very familiar with the area. They quickly made their way to the stadium entrance. The turnstile only needed a restart to work. However, John stopped Faisal's action because he accidentally noticed something seemed to be attached to the barrier. Indeed, this confirmed his suspicion. He then followed the activation wire inward, and a few seconds later, he saw a dense array of C4 bombs on the wall. He then reported this situation to the commander outside the stadium. This news terrified the official. As if it were detonated, there would certainly be massive casualties. Based on John's description, the expert nearby quickly analyzed that the bomb was installed beneath the control room to be discreet and to facilitate their escape. However, the only way to prevent the explosion was to seize the remote control from the thugs. But this was easier said than done. However, the specialist reminded them that the opponents would not detonate before finding Terry. But at this moment, the police commander was facing a dilemma. John noticed the police were at a standstill and suggested if they wanted Terry, let him find the man himself, as the police couldn't enter the stadium undetected. He requested the police provide Terry's location so he could apprehend him, and also have a helicopter take off and wait for him on the rooftop. John agreed to do it, but laid down one condition: if he safely brought Terry to the helicopter. In exchange, the police must safely get Danny out. The commander thought for a moment and agreed. The police and John then made simple arrangements. After confirming the exact helicopter pickup location, the specialist provided Terry's seat number, and Faisal immediately marked the location. The entire operation had to be completed within 12 minutes. With no time to waste, they had to act immediately in different directions. Danny and Faisal had to reach the evacuation point first, while John needed to find Terry in time. However, John's movements were quickly captured by the cameras, and White immediately analyzed his objective based on his actions. Thus, a race against time erupted, and John hadn't gone far before he was blocked. Seeing this, he planned to turn back and take a detour. However, he immediately realized he was surrounded. Left with no choice, he instantly burst into the adjacent room. But just as the few thugs thought they could trap him inside, the next second he rode a motorcycle out. Faced with this situation, a few of the men also quickly got on motorcycles and chased after him. They then weaved quickly through the crowd. The scene was utterly chaotic. But John couldn't worry about too much, so he both sped up and called for Faisal's help, but still no luck. With no other choice, John could only ride the motorcycle up the stairs. However, he was unaware that two men had doubled back to block him. So when John reached the upper floor and turned back, he crashed straight into the thug, blocking him. The opponent didn't hesitate to open fire on him. Seeing this, John grabbed a fire extinguisher and hit him hard, sending the thug flying. However, he was still not out of danger. The pursuer behind him continuously shot in his direction. Unexpectedly, John accidentally rode onto the rooftop. Naturally, the female assassin had also caught up. It seemed she would not give up until she killed John. But they quickly encountered a wall. With no alternative, John took a leap of faith, sharply reversed his direction, and continued to ride downwards. However, the female assassin unexpectedly fell during the pursuit. But even in this situation, she didn't give up, raising her rifle and firing straight at John. However, due to his excessive speed, she missed her shots. Inside the stadium, the match was in full swing, but John was in no mood to watch because his objective was still some distance away. Time was running out, and the female assassin behind him was still closing in step by step. Seeing this, John gritted his teeth, accelerated, and flew straight onto the canopy of another grandstand. In this way, John finally returned to the stadium safely. A few seconds later, he successfully found Terry. But just as they were talking, White also witnessed the scene. Although his older brother had changed significantly, he recognized him immediately. Terry originally did not want to go with John, but ultimately, under John's compulsion, he had to comply. At the same time, Danny and Faisal were found by the female assassin. Faisal even tried to stop her, but the next second he was knocked to the ground unconscious. Just like that, Danny fell into the hands of the terrorists. Naturally, John was completely unaware of this. He and Terry were rushing toward the evacuation point, but their figures were once again spotted by White. Therefore, the two were quickly intercepted. Fortunately, they reacted in time and were not hit by bullets, and John immediately counterattacked. At this moment, two more thugs appeared behind him. In this urgent situation, they had no choice but to rush into the restroom. However, this was a dead end. As expected, John and Terry were trapped inside. Meanwhile, the helicopter assigned for the pickup had arrived at the designated location. However, they didn't wait for Terry. The specialist was unaware that the target was now in a precarious situation. Although John seized the opportunity and shot dead another thug, they were still heavily suppressed in the corner. At the critical moment, John finally remembered the C4 explosive pack in his pocket. And this was his final lifeline. This confrontation instantly cost White 5 more subordinates. At this point, he was absolutely furious. Not long after John and Terry finally reached the designated location. However, John saw no sign of Danny. Just as he was extremely anxious, Danny's voice unexpectedly came over the radio. It turned out she had been taken next to White by the female assassin. Take one more step toward the helicopter, and the girl dies instantly. Faced with this situation, John finally stopped Terry from boarding the aircraft. Seeing this, the specialist, to prevent the target from falling into White's hands, ordered the special forces to fire directly at them. Fortunately, John sensed the danger and decisively pushed Terry down. He then ran into the building amid the dense hail of bullets. Although they were temporarily safe, White immediately demanded that John trade Terry for Danny at once. John didn't want to do it, but he also knew this group of thugs was capable of anything. There were now only 15 minutes left until the match ended. In the end, he agreed to White's demand. Very quickly, they all arrived at the designated location. However, just as the hostage exchange was about to happen, Danny unexpectedly realized the person approaching was John. But with a gesture from her uncle, she immediately understood his intention. Naturally, White was affected by the light and did not notice anything unusual, so by the time he realized it, it was too late. Immediately after the helicopter unexpectedly appeared in the air, it turned out this was all part of John's plan. This raid certainly caught the thugs by surprise. Casualties quickly mounted. John also took advantage of this opportunity to charge straight forward. After running out of bullets, he pushed White down the stairs. The two then wrestled with each other. Initially, John held the advantage thanks to his physique, but because he wanted to snatch the remote control from White, the opponent seized the opportunity and successfully counterattacked. Very quickly, the two separated again. However, just as John picked up the gun on the floor preparing to kill White, the female assassin unexpectedly appeared. Her sharp combat skills instantly overwhelmed John. And White also took this opportunity to get up and chase after Terry, who was running away. At the same time, John was subdued by the female assassin. Fortunately, he was strong enough to endure countless punches and kicks. But the final blow knocked the C4 detonator out of John's hand. Since this concerned the lives of everyone in the stadium, he rushed forward without hesitation. The moment John grasped it, he also plummeted straight down from the rooftop. Ultimately, the LED scoreboard saved his life. Terry, however, was not so lucky. He and Danny hadn't run far before they were found by White's remaining subordinates. Under the threat of a gun, they had no choice but to comply with the enemy's demands. Speaking of John, he was still shaken by what had just happened. Fortunately, the controller was still in his hand. However, at this moment, the female assassin unexpectedly caught up. Without a word, the two quickly engaged in combat. After a few blows, John was struck by a knife, but he also managed to grab the female assassin's arm. This time, he finally had a chance to counterattack. But unexpectedly, the female assassin was incredibly fierce. After kicking him away, she charged at him as if unafraid of death. The two then fell from a height together. Ultimately, the female assassin's body was impaled by a steel pipe, while John miraculously retained his life. However, he was shocked to find that the remote control he risked his life for was a fake. John was frantic, realizing he needed to find Danny and get her out of here immediately. Now there was not much time left until the explosion, and White finally met his brother Terry. It turned out the failure of the revolution years ago had always left him resentful. So he wanted to find his brother to reignite the war. However, he didn't understand why Terry had faked his death to escape. So in the end, Terry seized the opportunity and chose to give up. This scene finally drove White completely insane. His meticulously planned scheme of many years had failed. He ultimately chose to kill his own accomplice, grabbed Danny, and fled the control room. Meanwhile, John could not find Danny anywhere, but he knew the stadium was about to explode. So he told Faisal to immediately inform the audience near the control room to evacuate. However, most people still didn't know what was happening. But unexpectedly, the large LED screen now displayed images of White and Danny. Clearly, this was his final act of madness. However, John was extremely worried to see Danny captured by White. He then quickly rushed toward the control room. But just as he reached the center of the field, a violent explosion occurred on the opposite side, and John was thrown to the ground by the shockwave. At this point, all the spectators went crazy and poured out of the emergency exits. Not long after, John also regained consciousness after the explosion. He thought Danny must have died. However, he was then astonished to find the LED screen still displaying the previous image. Clearly, this was a pre-recorded video, and White would use the chaotic crowd to escape. So John frantically searched the surroundings. Indeed, he heard Danny's cries for help in the crowd ahead. Just as he ran towards the sound, White, in a desperate move, used his gun to hold Danny hostage. Faced with this situation, John could only slowly lower his weapon. However, right at this moment, the tables were completely turned. John finally seized the opportunity and decisively opened fire. Just like that, all the thugs who took over the stadium were successfully eliminated. And John single-handedly saved the lives of everyone in the stadium, including his niece. The value of a film lies in its reputation, and the value of a movie review lies in its feeling. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this film? Please leave your comments below.